Hello, and thank you for joining me. Hope everyone is well. And let's dive straight in. So today's daf is Bava Metzia 101 Amud A. Carry on the sentence from the last daf. Rabbi Shimon ben Pelzi says, and the value of the quarter log that they mention in the Mishnah is exclusive at the expense of processing olives to produce oil. The Mishnah teaches in the event that a river swept away one's olive trees and deposited them in the field of another, and they took root and yielded olives, then the olives are divided between the owner of the trees and the owner of the field. It also says that, Mishlaka says, the Torah is only in the case of where the olive trees were rooted and relocated together with that plot of earth in which they grew, and the ruling is with regard to olives that grew after 3 years, since the trees took root in a new field. But after 3 years, the Tosfot explained that the clods of earth with which the trees were transferred was sufficient to sustain the trees. Therefore, the trees are not considered to have been replanted, and there is no need to count anew the 3 years of Orla. This explanation is based on the assumption that were one to replant trees without clods of earth in which they had grown, the trees would be prohibited as Orla for the next 3 years. It would appear that the Rambam disagrees with this opinion and does not consider the presence of the clods of earth as a significant factor with regards to the prohibition of Orla. After 3 years, there is no longer any prohibition of Orla, see Leviticus 19:23 on the olives. Even one presumes that the olives were nourished from the field's owner's land. But during the first 3 years, during the first 3 years after the tree is planted, prohibited to derive benefit from its fruit due to the prohibition of Orla. This prohibition applies only to the fruit and not to other parts of the tree. In addition, prohibition does not apply to trees planted for reasons other than harvesting their fruit, e.g. those planted as a fence for property or as a wind buffer. While the prohibition applies both to trees in Eretz Yisrael and those outside Eretz Yisrael, if there is any uncertainty about the order status of fruit grown outside of Eretz Yisrael, the fruit is permitted. The halacha of Orla appear in the Torah in Leviticus 19:23-25 and the Nathan talks to Orla. During the 4th year, the produce is endowed with sanctity, and it must either be consumed within Jerusalem or redeemed for money that is then used to purchase other food which must be consumed within Jerusalem. After the trees took root in the new field, everything that grows is the property of the owner of the olive trees. As you can say to the owner of the field, even if you had planted the trees yourself at the time that they took root in your field, would you have eaten the olives during the first 3 years? If you claim that the nourishment from your land yielded the olives will be prohibited as Orla. The only reason for them to be permitted is if it is assumed that they were nourished only from the clods of earth, which they initially planted over 3 years ago. In which case, they should entirely belong to me as the owner of both trees and the clods. And we'll ask, but let the owner of the field say to him, if I had uprooted your trees from my field, and instead planted my own trees, then after 3 years I would have consumed all the olives yielded by them. Now that I let your trees remain, and you have the right to consume half with me, in return I should be entitled to half the yield during the first 3 years as well. The Gemara suggests another interpretation. Rather, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylon, he said named Reish Lakish, they told us only about a case where the olive trees were rooted and relocated together with the plot of earth in which they grew, and the ruling is with regard to olives that grew during the first 3 years, since the trees took root in the new field. But after the first 3 years, everything that grows is the property of the owner of the land. As you can say to the owner of the trees, if I had rooted your trees from my field and instead planted my own trees, then after 3 years, could I not have consumed all of the olives produced by them? The Gemara asks, but let the owner of the trees say to him, even if you planted trees yourself at the time my trees took root in your field, then during the first 3 years you would not have consumed their fruit at all. How then can you come now and claim that you're entitled to consume half of the olives together with me during those first 3 years? The Gemara answers, he has a right to demand half of the olive due to the fact that the owner of the field can say to the owner of the trees, if I removed your trees from my field and then planted my own trees, they would be slender plants that do not cast heavy shadows. And I would have planted shard, silka. What shard? Silka. Shard, Beta vulgaris kichla, is a subspecies of beet plant and an annual garden vegetable from the Chinosia family. Its large, fleshy leaves, 15 to 30 centimeters long, ready down to being cooked, and the flavor is similar to that of spinach. Today, the leaves are also serve as chicken feed. And there's a picture of a shard plant. and vegetables underneath the trees and made a significant profit. Since instead I let your trees remain, and return I paid the half of the fruit during the first 3 years. The sages taught advice that if the other one, the owner of the tree, said, I am uprooting and taking my own trees back, if the river stripped away one's olive trees and then deposited them in the field of another, and then the owner of the tree said, I am uprooting my trees and taking them back, the court did not listen to him in order to promote the settling of empty soil. The explanation of Rabbi Yochanan outside empty soil is permitted to take his trees back. If the trees were rooted together with the clods of earth, and during the first 3 years from when they took root in the new location, the owner of the trees and the owner of the field divided the olives between them, and after 3 years the owner of the field is entitled to all the olives. The Ramah cited in the Torah rules that this applies only where the clods of earth was sufficient to sustain the trees, and that otherwise the produce belongs to the owner of the field from the first year. This is according to the opinion of Ravin in the name of Reish Lakish. Rabbi Sefer Kinyan Yechuj Shehinim 410 Yechuj Mikra and the 68:1. The court does not listen to what's reading. Rabbi Yochanan said this due to the desire of promoting the settling of Eretz Yisrael. The straightforward understanding of the Gemara is that this is in order to promote the settling of Eretz Yisrael. Some commentaries rule that this also applies to any land that was owned by a Jew, even outside of Eretz Yisrael. According to this ruling, the Gemara's use of the term Eretz Yisrael should be understood as meaning the land of an Israelite, from the Meiri. It is inappropriate to retreat. Upon hearing this ruling, Rabbi Yirmiyah said, for rulings such as this, it is necessary to have a great sage explain it, as that reason is not self-evident. Some explain that the reason for this halacha was not obvious, and it took a great sage to explain it. Others explain that since halacha enjoins the owner of the trees from reclaiming his property, and so for a sage of stature to institute it in order to accept it, for people to accept it. So that's from the Torah Chaim. We learned in the Mishnah in Demai 6:2, Rabbi Yehuda says that one who receives a field from his ancestors from a Gentile, Kaba Sadei Avosur Min Hanachri, one who is a tenant farmer or a sharecropper in a field of a Gentile in Eretz Yisrael is required to first tithe the produce grown there and then give the Gentile his portion. The requirement to first tithe the produce is a penalty designed to encourage the person to purchase a field from the Gentile instead of remaining in a long-term sharecropper arrangement, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as the fact that the Gemara examines his opinion in detail suggests that his opinion is accepted as a halacha. And say the Ryan Hilchah Master 6:12, Chloch Yodeh 31 121, under the sharecropping agreement. If he's granted the right to cultivate land and keep this produce in return for keeping a portion of the produce to the Gentile owner, must he first tithe the produce grown in that field, and only then give the Gentile his portion from among the tithe produce. Initially, when the sages studied this mission, they assumed the following interpretation. What is the meaning of a field of his ancestors? This is a reference to any field in Eretz Yisrael. And why did they call it a field of his ancestors? Because it's a field of his forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Bava Metzia Daf. According to this interpretation, the mission is referring to a field which was legitimately acquired by a Gentile and to which the Jew has no claim. The Gemara explains why the Jewish sharecropper is required to tithe the produce he would give to the landowner. And the reason the sharecropper tithes that produce is that the Tanna holds that the Gentile's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael, the Tanaim disagree as to whether Gentile's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael abrogates its sanctity with regard to separating tithe from its produce. All agree that while the land is owned by a Gentile, its produce is not subject to a tithing obligation. They disagree about whether a Gentile's ownership of land entirely abrogates the sanctity of the land. According to the opinion that it does, even if you repurchase land from the Gentile, that would be considered a new act of conquering the land, which, since it was done by an individual and not by an entire nation, will not imbue that piece of land anew with sanctity. Consequently, even after the land was returned to Jewish ownership, his produce would not be subject to a tithing obligation. The other's opinion holds that the obligation to tithe is temporarily suspended while the Gentile owns it, and Gentile himself is not obligated to tithe, but that his ownership does not abrogate the land's sanctity. Therefore, as soon as the land transfers back into the Jewish possession, his produce will once again be fully subject to the tithing obligation. It does not abrogate its sanctity. If a Gentile acquired land in Eretz Yisrael and sold it to a Jew is required to take the room and tithe from its produce, as a Gentile's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael does not abrogate its sanctity, but with regard to separating tithes from its produce. By contrast, in Syria, Gentile acquisition of land does abrogate its sanctity with regard to separating tithes. From Sefer Devarim, Hilchot Teruma 1:10, Shulchan Aruch, Yodeah 3:31-3, with regard to separating tithes from its produce. And Rabbi Yehuda also holds that the obligation of one who received the field from his ancestors, i.e. a sharecropper, to pay the landowner is like that of a tenant farmer. What does that mean? There are various arrangements in which the landowner can profit by making his field available for another to work on it. In a sharecropping arrangement, a certain percentage of the produce yielded by the field is given to the landowner, and the rest is taken by the sharecropper. Consequently, the size of the payment to the landlord is entirely dependent on the success of the crops. By contrast, a tenant farmer provides the landowner with a fixed amount of produce, irrespective of the success of the crops, but is entitled to all the produce yielded by the field. One significant distinction between these two arrangements is with regard to the obligation to tithe the produce. In a sharecropping arrangement, since the landlord and sharecropper split the produce based on percentages, the portion the landlord receives is not considered to be a payment from the sharecropper to him. Rather, the landlord is considered to have an actual stake in the produce and is merely collecting that which he owns. Therefore, the responsibility to tithe the produce given to the landlord falls upon him. And if he is a Gentile, that produce does not need to be tithed. By contrast, a tenant farmer owns all the produce grown, and the produce he provides to the landlord is consequently considered to be a payment with the tenant farmer's own produce. Since all the produce initially belongs to the tenant farmer, he is obligated to tithe, even if the landlord is a Gentile. The Gemara here considers the option that a sharecropper is like a tenant farmer. From the Gemara, it would appear that according to this possibility, the aforementioned essential difference is not true. Despite this, Tosfot note that ultimately all agree to the essential difference between the two. The Gemara suggests that the possibility that the sages decree, and due to the concern that people would not be sensitive to the distinction between a sharecropper and a tenant farmer, the sharecropper should also tithe the produce before giving it to his landowner. Just as the tenant farmer, whether the field produces a crop or whether it does not produce a crop, is required to procure produce from somewhere, tithe it, and then give it to the landowner. As he is like one paying his debt, so too, when one receives a sharecropper, it's also like one paying his debt. And he must consequently first tithe the produce and then give it to the landowner. Since his obligation to the landowner is regarded as a debt, apparently before the produce is given to the landowner, it belongs to the tenant farmer or sharecropper, who is therefore required to tithe it. Rav Kahana said to Rav Papi, and some say that he said it to Rav Zivid. But this explanation is challenged by that which is taught in the Braita. Rabbi Yehuda says that one who receives a field from his ancestors, on the sharecropping agreement from a Gentile oppressor who seized it, first tithes produce and then gives the Gentile his portion. According to the sage's initial understanding, why does the Braita specifically refer to an oppressor who stole the land? Even if the Gentile was not an oppressor, the rule of the Braita would also apply. Rather, the Tana and the Mishnah hold that the Gentile's acquisition of the land of Eretz Yisrael abrogates its sanctity with regard to separating tithes from its produce, and he also holds that the obligation of one who receives it, like a sharecropper, to pay the landowner is not like that of a tenant farmer. So what's the footnote? Rashi suggests that the Gemara presents two independent possibilities to explain why, in the case of which the land is not from the sharecropper's actual ancestors, there was no obligation upon him to tithe the produce before giving it to the landowner. One possibility is that the Mishnah holds that a Gentile's acquisition of the land abrogates its sanctity. The other possibility is that the Mishnah assumes that the sanctity is not abrogated, but that the nature of the sharecropper's obligation is to pay the landlord is unlike that of a tenant farmer. Therefore, unlike a tenant farmer, he would be obligated to take tithe from produce before giving it to the landowner. A sharecropper is not obligated to do so. The Ran and many other early commentaries note that the Braita limits the requirement to tithe the produce before giving it to the landowner to a case where the landowner is a Gentile oppressor who seized the land. Since it is impossible to steal land, as it remains there for the owner to repossess. It emerges that the Gentile does not own the land at all. Therefore, the Ran, expanding on Rashi's interpretation, explains that the Gemara's intention here is that the question of whether or not a Gentile's acquisition of land can abrogate sanctity is entirely irrelevant. Even if one holds that it does abrogate the land sanctity, since the land is still legally owned by a Jew, there is a clear obligation to tithe his produce, and the tenant farmer will certainly have to tithe his produce before giving it to the landowner. Therefore, the Gemara proceeds to explain that despite there being a potential obligation to tithe the produce, a sharecropper is not unlike a tenant farmer and is consequently exempt from having to tithe produce before giving it to the landowner. Tosfot disagree with Rashi's interpretation. They understand that the claim that a sharecropper's obligation to tithe is unlike that of a tenant farmer is a corollary of the assumption that a Gentile's acquisition of the land abrogates its sanctity. They explain that even the Tana who holds that a sharecropper is regarded like a tenant farmer with regard to tithing, concedes that this is a rabbinic decree based upon the fact that others could confuse a sharecropper with a tenant farmer, who is obligated by Torah to tithe his produce before giving it to the landlord. But in circumstances where a tenant farmer is obligated to tithe by rabbinic law, a sharecropper will not be obligated at all. Accordingly, the Gemara should be understood as follows. Since the Gentile's acquisition of the land abrogates its sanctity, even the tenant farmer's obligation to tithe the produce is by rabbinic law. Therefore, in this case, the sharecropper is not regarded like a tenant farmer and is consequently not obligated, even by rabbinic law, to tithe the produce he gives to the landowner. From the Rambam's ruling as well, it would appear that even the tenant farmer's obligation to tithe is part of the fine imposed by the sages. Since under the sharecropping arrangement, the landowner retains a percentage stake in the yield, when the sharecropper provides the landowner with a portion of the produce, he is not considered to be paying a debt to him, but simply to be providing the landowner with the latter's own produce. Therefore, fundamentally, the sharecropper should not have to tithe the produce before giving it to the landowner. The requirement to do so is a fine that the sage imposed upon him, as the Gemara will explain. And according to this explanation, what's the meaning of a field of his ancestors? It's referring to a field that belonged to his actual ancestors, of whom he is their heir, and was then seized by a Gentile. It is only him whom the sages penalize and require to take tithe from produce before giving to the Gentile person, and since the land is dear to him, he will more readily go and receive it in a sharecropping arrangement from the Gentile, despite the sages' requirement. With regard to another person of the world at large, the sages did not penalize him, as no one else would be willing to receive the land under such disadvantageous terms. This explains why the sages limited the fine to a person who has an ancestral claim to the field. What was the reason that the sages penalized him? Rabbi Yochanan says it was in order to encourage him to purchase the field, so that it will clearly be in his possession. Bara biyado, clearly bara in his possession. The Rashi says that bara means clear, and the intention is that the Jew should be encouraged to purchase the land, bringing it clearly into Jewish ownership. This explanation is also supported by the Jerusalem Talmud. Most of the early commentaries had a version of the text that read boro, while some also interpret boro as meaning clear. Others say that it derives from the noun bor, meaning pit. They say that the goal is that working the land under such conditions should be as undesirable for the Jew as working a pit. Rabbi Hananiah explains that the intention is to make the arrangement undesirable for the Gentile, but due to the penalty, Jews will not be interested in working his land, and so it will be more advantageous for him to sell it. This advantageous conditions will make it preferable for him to purchase land outright from the Gentile instead of entering into the sharecropping arrangement with him. Upon hearing this ruling, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, for rulings such as this, it is necessary to have a great sage to explain it. An Amorite dispute was stated with regard to one who entered another's field and planted it without the permission of the owner of the field. So what's the footnote? Hanotea b'sdei chaveru below reshus. With regard to one who enters another's field and plants trees in it without the permission of the owner of the field, if it is a field that is designated for planting, then the court estimates how much a person would be willing to pay for someone to plant trees in that field. And that is how much the owner of the field must pay. If the field is not designated for planting, then the court appraises for the one who planted the trees both his expenses and the value of the improvement, and the owner of the field pays the less of the two amounts. The owner of the field may demand that the tree owner remove his trees. The owner of the trees does not have a right remove the trees because doing so weakens the land. This is in accordance to the statements of Rav and Shmuel and according to the explanation of Rav Papa, and well, their opinions do not disagree with one another. The Rambam says in Zich and Hilchah Zayla of Abaydas 10:4 Shulchan Aruch Mishpat in 75 1-2. Since the owner of the field profits from the planter's actions, he is required to pay him. Now it says the court appraises both the expenses for the one who planted the trees and the value of the improvements, and the planter is at a disadvantage. What's the footnote? Yada al Hatachtona. The commentary here is in accordance with Rashi's explanation. Other early commentaries interpret the Gemara to mean that the owner of the field must pay the minimum amount a person would pay for such work, says the Ritva. While the owner of the field pays the lesser of the two amounts. And Shmuel says the court estimates how much a person would be willing to give someone to plant trees in this field, and that is how much the owner of the field must pay. Rav Papa said, and Rav and Shmuel do not disagree. Here, Shmuel's ruling is with regard to a field that is designated for planting, while there Rav's ruling is with regard to a field that is not designated for planting. The Gemara knows, and this ruling of Rav was not stated explicitly, Lo beferish itma. Most of the inner commentary explain that the reference is not to Rav's statement itself, but specifically to Rav Papa's explanation of Rav's opinion. This understanding is reflected in the version of the text held by some commentaries, which reads, and this ruling of Rav Papa was not stated explicitly, says to see the Ravid, rather stated implicitly, as there was a certain person who came before Rav after someone had planted trees in that person's field. Rav said to him, go and have the court appraise both the expenses for the one who planted the trees and the value of the improvements. The owner of the field said to him, I do not want these trees, why should I pay for them? Rav said to him, go and have the court appraise both the expenses for the one who planted the trees and the value of the improvements. And he is at a disadvantage, i.e., you are obligated to pay him for the lesser of the two amounts. The owner of the field again said to him, I do not want these trees, why should I pay for them? Rav did not persist with his ruling, indicating that he conceded that the owner of the field was not obligated to pay. Eventually, Rav saw that the owner of the field had fenced in the field and was safeguarding the trees. There is a case of one who entered another's field, and without permission the owner of the field planted trees in it or built a building. If after the owner of the field fenced in the field in order to protect the trees, or he completed the building, or he performed any act that demonstrated that he was pleased with the addition of his property, the court estimates how much a person would be willing to pay for someone to plant those trees in that field or build that house, and that is how much the owner of the field must pay. This ruling is according to the opinion of Rav. I'm say for in the Zik and Hilchah Zayla of Aveda 10:8 Shulchan Aruch Mishpat 375:3. The field almost safeguarding the trees. Rav said to him, by doing so you have demonstrated your opinion that having those trees in your field is satisfactory to you. Therefore I rule that you should go and have the court appraise both the expenses for the one who planted the trees and the value of the improvements. And he has the advantage, i.e. you're obligated to pay him the greater of the two amounts. An Amorite dispute was stated with regard to one who entered another's ruin and built it up using his own materials, but without the landowner's permission. With regard to one who enters another's ruin and builds a house, and there, using his own materials but without the landowner's permission, the court appraises both the builder's expenses and the value of the improvements, and the landowner pays the lesser of the two amounts. Alternatively, the landowner has the right to demand that the builder dismantle the house and take back his materials. If he built in a courtyard that was going to be built up, or in a ruin that was going to be repaired, then the halacha is parallel to the case of planting in a field that was designated to be planted. The court estimates how much a person would be willing to pay for someone to do the work that the builder did, and the landowner must pay the builder that amount. This applies only if the builder built a structure that is suitable and common for that place. And that's what the Rambam says from the Zik and Hilchah Zayla of Aveda 10:9 Shulchan Aruch Mishpat 375:6-7. And then later the builder said to the landowner, I will dismantle the structure and take my timber and my stones back. Nachman says the court listened to him and he is allowed to do so. Rav Sheshes said the court does not listen to him and he is not allowed to do so. The Gemara raises an objection to Rav Nachman's ruling from a Brit in Tosefta Bava Kama 10:6 about a similar case. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, Beis Shammai say that the court listens to him, and Beis Shammai say the court does not listen to him. The Gemara explains the difficulty posed. Shall we say that Rav Nachman said that his ruling is according to the opinion of Beis Shammai? That is untenable, as this is not listed as one of the specific examples to the principle that halacha is always in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel. The Gemara says, Rav Nachman states his opinion according to the opinion of that Tana, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, as is taught in the Brayso, according to both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the court listens to him. This is the statement of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Beit Shammai say that the court listens to him, and Beit Hillel say that the court does not listen to him. The Gemara inquires, what conclusion was reached about this matter? Rabbi Yaakov said, Rabbi Yochanan said, and that moves on to next Ahmed. Thank you for listening. Peace in Israel and have a very good day. All the best. Bye.